History can be found anywhere, even in your own backyard. So join us as we search the land looking for the stories that helped shape this nation. Come on the porch, grab a drink, and join us for a little bit of history from the homestead. Hey there, history buffs, and welcome to this episode of the History from the Homestead podcast. I am your host, Thomas Carroll, and joining me today is Kaylynn Howard from the Mount Rushmore. Kaylynn, welcome.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
So tell us a little bit about yourself real quick, and then we'll just dive on in.
Sounds good. Here at Mount Rushmore, I am one of the lead park ranger interpreters. So I'm a permanent year-round employee here, and I get to help schedule our frontline staff carrying out the daily duties and all of our interpretive program for our visitors to enjoy. And I love the opportunity myself to get to hop in and give programs to the visiting public as well.
Excellent. Mount Rushmore is a pretty well-known park, but kind of before Mount Rushmore isn't exactly as well known. We're talking way back to Native Americans, which we're going to cover briefly before we dive into how it was made.
Yeah, the Black Hills here in South Dakota are culturally and spiritually significant to numerous indigenous nations and peoples since time immemorial. And so many indigenous people continue to practice ceremonies in the Black Hills and consider this to be their ancestral homeland. There are many different emergent stories to different tribes that exist here. And here at Mount Rushmore, present day, we do have ongoing work with 21 different associated tribal nations.
And that's great to keep that because they were the first ones here well before us. But there was lots of treaties, lots of wars and stuff, but we're going to save all that for another show, hopefully, because we could probably talk about that till midnight and not get to where we're at. So we're going to focus today on Mount Rushmore itself, which is, I've never personally been there. I hope to one day. But actually, I got the idea for a show if a guy from work was just visited there a couple weeks ago. And I said, I got to do a show about that.
Come out for a visit. It's definitely touches a lot of people and innumerable ways that come and visit. This place means something different to everybody.
Where did the idea to carve it come from originally anyway?
Yeah, the idea actually came from South Dakota State historian Doane Robinson. His idea was simply to bring tourism here to South Dakota. He was a very proud South Dakotan, and he thought that everybody should come from all over to see what this special place had to offer. And especially during the early 1920s, as the automobile was gaining popularity and this idea of that great American road trip, people were heading west. A lot of them were heading out towards the most famous national park, Yellowstone. And he thought that they should have something to stop and see along their way here and spend their hard-earned dollars touring around the Black Hills of South Dakota. So he came up with this idea for a mountain carving here in the Black Hills. But his original idea was not on this mountain, and it was not presidents. His original idea was actually to carve Western heroes in his mind, different personalities from that, Western era, such as Lewis and Clark, Buffalo Bill Cody, Chief Red Cloud, and Sacagawea. So the likes of those folks he really wanted to put on display here.
Interesting. I didn't even know that. I always thought it was just the idea for the presidents. That's interesting. How was the location chosen?
So Doane Robinson's original idea was to carve the Needle spires out along the Needles Highway in Custer State Park. And so he had that idea And that's where he thought that they should be carved. These needle spires, they're quite magnificent to see, and they are incredibly old, but they are a sight to behold. So he thought those would be the perfect places to carve in the round these people's figures. And he was not a mountain carver, nor was he an artist himself, so he had to find one. And he landed on a gentleman by the name of Gutzon Borglum. And Gutzon Borglum came at Doan Robinson's invitation to the Black Hills. And as they were touring around, Gutzon Borglum soon discovered that those needle spires were not going to be good for carving because of how old they were and how eroded away they already were. And so he said, you know, in order to carve mountains, I have to apply dynamite. And if I put dynamite on these needle spires, they will crumble. So they continued to scout around in the hills until they came upon Mount Rushmore. And that's how Gutzon Borglum decided that this would be the mountain. Doan Robinson, you know, was very on board with that idea. And they went ahead and went through the process of getting permission from the United States government to carve this mountain.
For a little perspective, how tall are these carvings? You know,
Yeah, so to give you an idea, George Washington's face from the chin to the top of the head is 60 feet tall. And the shortest head is President Roosevelt at 58 feet tall.
poor Roosevelt, he's the small one. Yeah, and that's just the faces. You know, that's not the whole mountain. The mountain is much higher than that, and it sits quite a ways above, for lack of a better word, above the ground. You know, mountains obviously don't go straight up, but you know they're considerably high up, and it's quite fascinating how they did it.
Yes, yeah, I'm happy to talk about the carving process if you'd like.
That would be great. That was the direction I was heading, and how they did it.
Yeah, I mean, it takes a lot. It's not like a canvas that you can just start painting upon. And so Gutzon Borglum sees this mountain, and it was ideal for a couple of different reasons. One, it had enough of a flat granite face that he would be able to carve, unlike those needle spires that were pretty thin and eroded away. And additionally, one reason that attracted Gutzon Borglum to this mountain in particular was that it faces southeast. So it does get the best rays of sun from sunrise all the way throughout the day when the sun sets. And so he thought that would be the perfect canvas for a place like Mount Rushmore. And so to get started carving a mountain, you kind of have to know where to go, what you want to do, and it's going to take a lot of precision. And before Gutzon Borglum came here to carve this mountain, he already got practice down in Atlanta, Georgia, on a project called Stone Mountain. So that's kind of where he learned the craft of mountain carving. And I like to think that he came here and perfected that craft on Mount Rushmore. And so over his time here, he actually created 9 different scale models that he would use in order to take measurements off of, translate those up onto the mountain so that the carvers were able to make those, all the carvings that were required, all that work that was necessary. Pardon me. And it was really important because the granite here is called Harney Peak granite. And it really, the density of this granite is really good for carving. It will hold that form. And so how he kind of got started was creating that sculpture or that scale model, I should say. And then he had this idea where there would be winches attached to the top of the mountain. Attached to those winches were these thin little chairs called bosun chairs. And workers would very daringly get in those chairs and basically be lowered over the face of this mountain, suspended hundreds of feet in the air. And so it takes a lot to be able to learn how to do this. One thing that Gutzon Borglum used, one technique he used was paint and measurement marks on that mountain so that people knew where to put those first initial, that first initial carving and those jackhammers in right away. And so he used a pointing system. And so on top of his scale model, he had basically a protractor on top of the head, the arm came out, and down came a plumb line and the plumb bob. And so depending on what feature he wanted to carve, he would take that measurement on that scale model, jot that down, that would be translated up the mountain. Oftentimes there would be paint on the sculpture to identify what needed to be drilled and how much dynamite needed to be used. So in order to carve a mountain, dynamite's going to be a really good friend to Guts and Borglum. Over 90% of Mount Rushmore was carved using dynamite alone. So that was the first step into how do you, take this huge granite mountain and hew out the faces of 4 very significant men in our
Yes.
nation's history.
You might not be able to answer, but do we know how much dynamite he used? Because I'm kind of a firebug. I like a good explosion.
Unfortunately, not something that was kept much track of. There have been, very rough approximations over the years, but nothing that we could give like an accurate figure on, unfortunately. But yeah, rough approximations. It is estimated, but that 450,000 tons of rock was blasted off of Mount Rushmore.
That's a lot.
Yeah, they got within 3 to 6 inches of the finished product that we see today just using dynamite.
As I say, because you can still see all the rubble and everything at the base from where it has been blasted off or chipped off or chiseled off or however.
Yes, you can. And even when you're out hiking along the Presidential Trail, our main trail here in the park, you can actually see, if you look up, we call it the talus slope, but you look up that big rock slope and you can still see carving marks and jackhammer marks in that rock that was blasted off. So you can feel that history, right before you.
Wow, that's the kind of stuff I like about history, where you can see it and have a connection to it. That's what's wonderful. How many people did it take to carve this? How many people and how long?
Yeah, so over 14 years is how long it took to carve Mount Rushmore. So from 1927 to 1941, Guts and Borglum had about 400 workers who helped to make Mount Rushmore as we see it today. However, it wasn't 400 people at work. By and large, the standard crew was about 50 people or so at any given time. And so these workers, many of these men were actually miners by trade. They had been used to working mining claims hundreds of feet underground, and Guts and Borglum put them to work hundreds of feet above ground.
And now, was the work done? Was it done year round, or 'cause the weather up there can be pretty hateful wintertime? So did they take winters off, or did they work year round?
It would depend. So when really harsh winters would come, the carving could stop for a time. And then as well, funding lapses made work stop. So actual carving time, we do consider it's actually about 6.5 years of carving time, given lapses in funding and harsh weather conditions.
Oh, that's incredible. Are there any mistakes? Did they make any mistakes there that you maybe kind of can't see from a distance, but if you get up and look, did they make any mistakes? I gotta know.
I wouldn't necessarily say mistakes, but when you're working on a mountain and you don't entirely know all of the rock that runs through a mountain until you start blasting, that's when you find discrepancies and different things that require change. And so one of the biggest changes, and not necessarily a mistake, but a very difficult decision for Guts and Borglum, was they got 18 months into Thomas Jefferson's face. They were about partway down his face when they started seeing different veins of different rock and cracks in that granite that were not going to hold. And so Guts and Borglum envisioned this being a sculpture that lasts for thousands of years. This granite here erodes about 1 inch per 10,000 years. So when he was carving down, they got 18 months into Thomas Jefferson's face. He saw different things in that rock that he just knew Thomas Jefferson's face might fail in a few hundred years. And he's not making a carving for hundreds of years. He's making a carving for thousands of years. So he made the very difficult decision to blast Thomas Jefferson's face off of the mountain. So it was originally on the other side of George Washington. And from there, he put it just on the other side. He had to make another scale model. All in all, he made 9 of them. And he had to make a different scale model and readjust and put Thomas Jefferson where he stands today. But the trouble with Jefferson wasn't done as he started carving into Jefferson's face where its location is today. He saw a vein of rock that ran through his face. And if Thomas Jefferson were looking straight ahead, like we see the other presidents' faces, well, that rock would have run right through his nose. He did not want to have an American Sphinx, if you will, with that nose falling off. And so he decided to tilt Jefferson's head up as we see it today, so that that rock would run through his cheek and down through his lip. But a piece of that vein was actually rose quartz, and he didn't necessarily want that to make Thomas Jefferson's lips look weird. And so he had this piece of quartz in his top lip. They carved it out. They took a big chunk of granite, carved it to be that same shape, and they simply put it in his top lip, and it's held there today by gravity.
Well, how about that? That's interesting. I never knew that.
Yeah, fun fact. Some of
Yeah,
our
I
rangers
mean,
say Jefferson had a lip job. Don't know about that phrasing, but he definitely had some work done to keep his face as it is today.
I mean, would you call that plastic surgery, or what do you call that? Because it's
Rock and surgery, I guess.
yeah, perfect. um, why were those 4 presidents chosen? Because there are lots of options they could have had.
So many, yes. And so it was Gutzon Borglum himself who convinced Stone Robinson to change that idea from Western heroes. And the reason he wanted presidents is because he wanted something more universal that all Americans could come and enjoy and really be inspired by. And his idea was he only wanted to represent the first 150 years of American history. And so with that, he chose these 4 presidents. And he chose Washington for the birth or the foundation of our nation, being our very first president. He chose Thomas Jefferson for the expansion of our nation through his purchase, the Louisiana Purchase. He chose pardon me, he chose Abraham Lincoln for the preservation of our nation, holding us together through the Civil War. And lastly, he chose Theodore Roosevelt, not for what most people would guess, not for his conservation efforts to the national parks or public lands, but he actually chose him for the development of our nation, from his determination in building the Panama Canal and finally connecting both oceans together. And so that's why those 4 were chosen to represent our country up there.
That's really interesting. I always thought Teddy Roosevelt was up there because of his conservation.
Yeah.
They're wrong again.
And I will say he was actually one of the more controversial picks to go up there. Nobody seemed, really to bat an eye at the first 3 presidents that were chosen. But Theodore Roosevelt brought some interesting comments from the public. Because Roosevelt had only been, dead less than a decade, people said, he hasn't been gone long enough to know what his lasting legacy on this country is. Why would you choose him? But Gutzon Borglum, he knew that he was the right pick to go up there.
I would say his legacy handled pretty well for as far as conservation and everything. That's interesting. It's almost like you're saying, he hasn't been dead long enough, poor guy. He should have died years ago. Then maybe we'd put him up there. So, well, let's talk about Mount Rushmore today, because the beauty of the National Park Service and everything, there's more than just the land to go see. There's always programs. There's, volunteer programs and stuff. So I thought it'd be a good chance to talk about those because they're very important to keeping these historic sites alive and well.
Yeah, we're very happy with what we're able to offer the visiting public. We do welcome, last year was over 2.4 million visitors here to Mount Rushmore. And so with that, we want to ensure that we're having lots of opportunities for our visitors to experience this special place. One of our most popular things is our evening lighting ceremony. So from Memorial Day until the end of September every year, we do have every night is our evening lighting program. That's a 10-minute ranger talk down in our big amphitheater outdoors. After that, it's a 20-minute park film. It concludes with the sculpture being illuminated, and then all veterans, active duty, and Gold Star families are invited down to the stage where they are honored in front of all of our visitors for their service to our nation. And then we lower and retire the colors for the evening. So it's a very special program that has been such a highlight here for so many visitors over many, many years. So that's every night from Memorial Day to Labor Day, and then daily in the summertime as well. And that same time frame, we go into October as much as staffing allows. We do have daily ranger programs. So those are 30-minute programs that happen, periodically throughout the day. And so all of those topics vary. Each of our park rangers here, they do their own research and pick different topics and themes that relate here to Mount Rushmore. We also are very excited to offer cultural programming from Lakota artists and historians. And so we do 7 days a week. We have Lakota hoop dancers who come, and on our Grand View Terrace, our main viewing terrace here in the park, they do some hoop dancing for our visitors to enjoy. They share some of their culture and the history of hoop dancing and the significance of the Black Hills. We also have our Heritage Village as well, and we have cultural interpreters out there who get to share the history of this place, the history of Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota people, and what the significance of not only Mount Rushmore, but the Black Hills as a whole to their culture. And then lastly, one thing that we have open in the summer as well is our Sculptors Studio. And that is a historic studio that Guts and Borglum worked out of. And on display in there, we do have the last scale model used to help carve the mountain. And when that's open at the top of every hour, there are it's a 15-minute ranger presentation over the carving process.
That's wonderful. And I encourage everybody to volunteer for whatever volunteer programs your nearest or local National Park Service has, because they're part of the reason why we have what we have. So, and go help out as much as you can.
Yeah, and if I may, I just want to share too, we have some exciting projects we're working on for visitors coming soon. We have our Stone Hoop Garden that is put together with consultation from our tribal partners, and that will be completed by the end of this year. And then next year, we have 2 new park films are debuting in the summer of 2025. And so visitors who come and see our evening lighting program, they'll get to view a new park film next year. And in our theaters inside, there will be a new park film to watch as well. So we're really excited about these upcoming projects we have, including a wider range of voices, including our tribal partners, to continue to have that representation here.
See, now you sold me. Now I have to go. Having never been there, I have to go now. Kaylynn, I thank you very much for taking the time to talk about this, for talk about Mount Rushmore. It's a very well known but important piece of history, for more reasons than I knew, as we learned today.
Yeah, some of us, we like to consider it Guts and Borglum's love letter to America. He called it the Shrine of Democracy. So it's a very special place to him, and it's a special place to a lot of people who get to come and visit and experience it.
Yes. So everybody make sure you go. And I thank you again very much for talking to me.
Thank you.
Thanks to everybody for listening. Remember, if you like the show, you can share it with all your friends. We can be found on all the major podcast players. We can be found on Facebook. And you can also find us and catch the show notes at historyfromthehomestead.com.